Hey, new VFXers, welcome back. Today I want to take a few excerpts from one of our courses to talk about HDRI, those magic letters that a lot of people like to use. A lot of people think they know what it's all about, and a lot of people are kind of confused, but they know, hey, it may be good for color correcting, it may be good for rendering CG images, but what's really going on behind the scenes, and how do you actually make one of those, and what use of it, most importantly, what use is it to me, and how important is it that I know basically all about it? These videos are from our course Lighting and Rendering here at Stage 3 VFX. And the first one is basically just talking about HDRI, explaining it without using any software or any of that gobbledygook, right? Let's just actually analyze what HDRI is. And then in our next video, part 2, I'm going to show you the advantage of it in a typical compositing program. Hey, welcome back. So we're going to light a scene in Maya with an HDRI. What exactly is an HDRI anyway? I mean, you could download an image off, Google Images or the internet or something. Is that an HDRI? I mean, if you take a photo of a mountain scene, could you use a image? Could you use that image to light your car or your person in Maya? Well, no. An HDRI is a very specific kind of image. And let's talk about what actually is the recipe to make one of those. So here we are. Pretend this is the outside, right outside of our office that we're working right now, or our studio, wherever we are. And congratulations, you have an absolutely fantastic, beautiful view, right? And to pretend we want to actually capture everything in this scene with a typical camera, right? But we want to capture all the light values, the lights and the darks, the shadows, the highlights, and everything in between, right? If you wanted to capture all this light information, if you want to basically capture as much light information as possible, the more light information you capture into an image, the better the HDRI image is going to be. And the better the HDRI, the better your renders are going to look, right? So this is the original scene in nature. And if you consider for a moment the range of the darkest shadows and the highest highlights, the darkest shadows maybe is in a little crevice of these trees way back there, right? And then the highest highlights could be the reflectivity of the snow from the sun or something like that. And if you think about that whole range, from the darkest darks to the brightest brights, it's probably pretty huge. It's a huge, huge range, right? Who knows how big? Who knows how, it's just a ton of data in there, right? Well, if you really wanted to capture all this with your typical camera, okay, whether you're using this little Nikon camera or any kind of camera, really, what you're actually going to do is you're at the limitation of the device capturing the scene. That's kind of common sense, right? I mean, this Nikon camera or Canon or even a Red camera or an Arriflex or a Panasonic, whatever the fanciest camera you have, it's still not going to capture everything in nature, right? Because there's just so many values in the real world that we haven't built a device yet that's going to capture everything, right? It's just the limitations of human technology. So what it does is it captures as much as it can, right? And it captures as much as it can, and that's a little different for every kind of device that you're using. An iPhone is going to capture a different range of data than a really fancy, $50,000 camera, like a Red Cam or something. Is going to probably capture more data, but they're both limited by the device. So pretend this camera right here that we're using took the entire real scene in nature and could only capture this much, okay? And if it could only capture this much of the scene, as far as, not color, we're talking about brightness values, right? We're talking about levels of luminosity, mostly. And the camera says, well, I can only recognize maybe this, shade of black, and anything blacker than that, I really can't identify, so I'm just going to call it black. And that's what it means when something is clipped. Okay, when it's clipped, it just says that may be really, really, really dark, but I'm just going to call it 0. Okay, so pretend black is 0, and pretend 1 is white, 0 to 1. And it tries to capture perhaps all the data in the brightest highlights up here. And it can only capture so much. So anything brighter than what the camera can capture, it also clips. And it just says anything more than that, I can't capture. I'm just going to call it white. And all white is the same to me, right? So you've kind of lost all this data right here. You're only getting this much. And that's called an LDR image, a low dynamic range image, okay? So how do you capture all the brightness values, or at least a lot more than you could with a typical photo? Most photos that you're going to take with your phone or a fancy camera like this or anything like that will only capture this much. How do you capture even more? Well, what you do is you can bracket the photo. Bracketing your shot means that you can take multiple exposures of the same scene. Okay. And then you can find a way to kind of combine them all. And when we talk about exposure, you're adjusting the camera to be more sensitive towards a range of light that's either higher or lower, right? So if the camera can only capture, what is this? Maybe 2 inches of range. Well, if you overexpose the shot and then capture it, you're going to capture the 2 inches up here. And then if you lower your exposure settings, it's going to capture the 2 inches of range or so down here. And that's only 2 brackets, right? Ideally, you'd want a lot of those brackets going up and down to capture as much as possible. But for the sake of simplicity, let's just say we're capturing, the middle scene here and then the highs and the lows right over here. Now, it can't save them all in one image, so it's actually taking 3 photos, isn't it? Photo 1, photo 2, photo 3. So once you've bracketed that, here's what you get. Pretend you are shooting this really fancy building somewhere. This is your typical photo that you took without any exposure correction. And then I'm going to take my camera and I'm going to set it to -2 exposure values. So -2 exposure values, what does that do? It's going to darken the scene, right? But check this out. You're getting a lot more detail in the clouds, aren't you? For example, see the detail in the clouds right here? It's mostly just white with a little bit of blue in there, but look at all the detail over here. Because we've lowered our exposure values down in the camera, it's getting more detail in the highlights. And now we're also going to go the other way. We're going to raise our exposure to, but 2 stops right here. And doing so, we obviously lose everything in the sky, but check this out. We're gaining detail in the shadows right down here. I didn't see any of this, cool little carvings. Well, we saw a little bit of it, but we really see a lot of it right up here. We see none of it over here, right? So we're kind of bracketing the camera to get as much detail as possible through all different range of luminosity, aren't we? So what do you do with these photos once, they also call it, sometimes burst mode. If you click on that and it takes lots of different exposures. Bracketing is mostly the term we're talking about. So what do you do with all these photos? Saving all these different exposures, you can save them all in one file, which is very, very handy. You could save all these different exposure values in one file. And that file is called an HDR, a high dynamic range image, because it's saving all your different levels of exposure into one image right there. And as you can see, now this one HDR image that we've just built from different exposures now has this much range, doesn't it? This was the original ranges, bracketing, combining together gives us this much. Now, it looks equivalent to the original range that was in nature. And that is inaccurate because in HDR, it's still going to be a lot, less, values of luminosity than the real world, but it comes a heck of a lot closer than what we were doing over here. Okay. So I don't want you to think you've captured everything in the scene that's in nature in the real world. Not really the case. Not yet anyway. Who knows? Maybe in the future they'll invent a camera that does that, but you certainly captured a ton more information, and we can use all that information to light our scenes in 3D. How cool is that? This format is fantastic for, again, like we said, lighting 3D scenes, but also it's great. It's a great format if you need to do color correcting because there's so much data in there and a lot more. Tone mapping goes along with all this, and we'll talk a little bit about that later. But now that we know what an HDR is and high dynamic range is, and we know how it's built, and we now know that the magic of it has kind of been, removed. We've looked behind the curtain and we can see what it does. Let's play around with these in Maya. I'll see you in a minute.